That's what the web's about. It's about people getting together, connecting, talking about what we want to talk about, not what other people think that we should be talking about. We get to set our own agenda. That is so wildly true. It's so obviously true now, even though the infrastructure for that didn't rise until basically with Facebook, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I'm going to ramble for a moment, but I say unfortunately because the infrastructure for pages, for the web, which consists of web pages, was created and put into the public domain. Nobody owns it, so everybody got to build on it and extend it and all the rest of it. We did a fantastic job connecting pages, all of us, on the web. But connecting people, we left that to Facebook, which succeeded so well that with a private set of protocols and locked up data and all the rest of it. And that was a tragic, tragic error. I don't know by whom, but it was a tragic turn that the web took. Connected pages, but gave away connecting people.
Author and technologist David Weinberger spends a lot of time trying to understand how the internet and machine learning impacts our lives and our beliefs. He joins Jon and Scoop to discuss the current state of the internet, the web, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and more on the Plutopia podcast.
Hey, welcome to another session with the Plutopia crew, Scoop Sweeney and John Lebkowski. And our guest today is David Weinberger. David explores the effect of technology on our lives, our businesses, and our ideas. His latest book, Everyday Chaos, looks at how machine learning and the internet are changing our ideas about how the world works and how to flourish in it, how to thrive. And I will just mention that David was one of the co-authors of the Cluetrain Manifesto some years ago, which was a book that had a clue, hopefully.
20 years
So,
ago.
David, how you doing?
I seem to be partially invisible, thanks to grotesque green screen, but it's either the invisible head or the storage locker look of my office. So we're going to go with the missing pieces of my head.
What you should really say is, oh, I'm wearing my cloak of invisibility.
Yeah, only on selected portions of my skull, though.
It's much in demand, you know. Well, how have you been weathering the COVID storms and the political storms?
Fine. Our children got COVID and got over it without any problems. Thankfully, we have not gotten it yet, but we are. The past couple of months, we've been seeing our grandchildren who are locals, and they are a vector of disease, as I like to think of them, as I dandle them on my knee, because it's just too hard not to, and it's irrational, and it's, we believe in science, and we're doing generally, I would say, an 8 out of 10 job on taking care of ourselves, maybe even 9 out of 10, I don't know, something like that. We don't see anybody or go anywhere having it in since March, except for the grandkids. So that's how we're doing. And politically, when will this air, John? Ask me.
Probably in a couple of weeks. It'll air before the election.
In that case, I will be even worse than I am now. And maybe even a few days after it airs, I'll be better, but I'm not feeling that way. So.
Yeah, we're not sure, are we? Well, it seems to me that there's kind of a political weird sort of meltdown right now, and a complete crisis of authority and belief, and that nobody really anymore knows whether the thing that they're reading or the thing that they're hearing or even the thing that they're seeing is really there. I mean, it's a very strange time.
Yes, it's an indescribable and inexplicable time. I mean, literally inexplicable and unpredictable.
Which we never really quite envisioned. I would have.
No, I mean, we always expect unpredictability, you know, otherwise you're not paying attention to anything. I mean, in normal times, we've gotten so used to unpredictability that we think things are predictable, but they never are. And these days, when you have you have a chaos president, then it's um, way less predictable than ever. At least the unpredictability of it comes to the fore, which in general I think it's really good and important to acknowledge how unpredictable things are, especially during normal times. But when you can't avoid it, it's at least good to recognize it. It's healthy to recognize it.
Yeah, I guess a strong commitment to chaos pretty much kills predictability, doesn't it?
When your strategy is to, if your strategy is to dominate the news by being unpredictable and you don't really care what you say, so long as it's basically stand-up comedy, right? You try things out, you see which things work. We'll build a wall. They'll pay for it. Um, in order to get a response and to grab some headlines, then there's necessarily novelty and unpredictability are the things that were being sold. It's his strategy, he who shall not be named. It's his strategy and his tactic and his character. Um, then yeah, it's unpredictable on purpose. And I hope that it's a meager hope. I hope that we carry out of this after it gets more normally predictable, that we carry out of it this continuing sense of the unpredictability of everything, even eclipses.
And I'm sure we'll talk more about that unpredictability. But before we get too far along, I had mentioned Cluetrain, and I just wanted to ask you if you really think the Cluetrain Manifesto is still relevant and that we can still say that markets are conversations, among other things.
Yes and no. So, I mean, the positive side of it is that I think the central things that Cluetrain said actually were right. It was 4 people who wrote it, so I'm not patting my own back. I'm patting my back and 3 other people's. Um, Doc Searles and Rick Levine and Christopher Locke. I think that the basic idea of it was correct, and it's so taken for granted now that it's hard to remember that people didn't recognize the central idea of the Cluetrain Manifesto, which was that the web is not primarily a publishing place. It is, of course, a publishing place, but not primarily or only. It's not primarily a place for doing business transactions, for buying things, which were the 2 prevailing views in 1999 when we posted the site. That's how the media were covering it, by and large. But everybody who was on it just about at that point wasn't there in order to buy things and wasn't there in order to gather information, although we did that too. And we weren't there to read the online publications in the mainstream media, although we did that when possible. We were there to connect with one another, to talk with one another. The term social media, even the idea of social media, came well after the web. The web was about connecting pages. And on top of that infrastructure, a very loose social network arose. People on the web who were communicating through pages and other things as well. But the main thing that Cluetrain said, from my point of view, is that's what the web's about. It's about people getting together, connecting, talking about what we want to talk about, not what other people think that we should be talking about. We get to set our own agenda. That is so wildly true and so obviously true now, even though the infrastructure for that didn't arise until basically with Facebook, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I'm going to ramble for a moment, but I say unfortunately because the infrastructure for pages, for the web, which consists of web pages, was created and put into the public domain. Nobody owns it, so everybody got to build on it and extend it and all the rest of it. We did a fantastic job connecting pages, all of us, on the web, but connecting people, we left that to Facebook, which succeeded so well that with a private set of protocols and locked up data and all the rest of it. And that was a tragic, tragic error. I don't know by whom, but it was a tragic turn that the web took. Connected pages, but gave away connecting people. So I think that was basically, that remains the case. And just to catch up on our markets conversations still, that was Doc Searle's, one of his contributions, probably the most famous clue in the manifesto. Yeah, to a large extent, that's true. So if you want to buy anything of any worth or even little worth, you're very likely going onto the web and finding other people who are talking about it. And sometimes they're shills, but you try to find places where you think you can trust what people are saying. And they are not giving the marketing messages from the manufacturers, and they are answering specific questions about whether this car will work in a Boston winter, or whether this game allows you to respawn frequently or to save, or whatever it is that you care about. So that's true. One of the tragic turns, however, has been the rise of algorithmic targeting of individuals and the rise of irrational, because that sort of conversation is rational. They're fun, but you have a question, you get an answer. And what advertisers have been doing now for quite a while is pushing our invisible, non-rational buttons, trying to find the things that we respond to, which may even be against our own interests, and playing that keyboard and hitting those chords so that we at least tend to do what they would like. And that is, advertising has always tried to do that. In the 1950s, they were using Freudian principles. I reread The Hidden Persuaders not too long ago from 1957, and that's what that was, exposing the Freudian underpinnings of advertising. And it strikes us now as ridiculous. And all the ways in which Freud was wrong, makes the most of that. Freud was right in a whole bunch of ways, but nevertheless, that's what advertising has been trying to do for a long time, to press our invisible buttons to get us to do what we would not do if you made a rational decision. Behavioral economics has confirmed this. The rise of algorithmic advertising has, I sort of don't like the term weaponized, but I'm going to use it, has weaponized that. Sorry, really long answer to a very casual question, John. It's what I do.
Well, in the early days of the internet and the web, everyone spoke about the free and open internet. What happened to that free and open internet? Where did it go?
It's on the internet. It's just not.
But the concept seems to have been replaced by not so free and not so open. Things like net neutrality seems to be threatened.
Yeah, so there are lots of different layers of that, and you're completely correct. There's all sorts of things that we hoped would not, and many of us mistakenly thought could not be captured and controlled, have been. Facebook, obviously, where much of the world does its socializing. Net neutrality in the United States has been repealed by the Trump administration. I have some hope it will be reinstated, and properly so, in the US. I think worse than that is the capture. We used to have thousands of ISPs, mom and pop ISPs. Now we have a handful, and they are enormously influential in what we do on the internet. They are doing everything they can to monetize it and to turn it basically into TV. The very fact that typically they give us much more bandwidth for downloading than for uploading tells you everything about what they think the internet is for. It's for people sitting passively and, quote, consuming content. Doc would kill me. Doc Searles would kill me but I did the air quote, so it's okay, because it's not just content, and we don't consume it. Nevertheless, much of what we do on the internet, where the we, I think, is actually fairly inclusive, is done either on the free internet or on a reasonable facsimile of the free internet. When it's a reasonable facsimile, I'm not very happy. I will get in trouble for saying this, but a place like Twitter or Reddit, for example, where we are quite free to say almost anything that we want. Of course, what we want to say is then bounded by their rules, some of which are sensible and some of which I'm not, In those venues, we are able to connect. There often the affordances are quite good for connecting with people, for moderating conversations, because it turns out global unmoderated conversations are just accidents waiting to happen. I mean, it's very hard to have a conversation with people with whom you do not share a great deal of common um, norms and ways of talking about things, and how much humor you're allowed to use, or sarcasm, or cursing, or how long you're allowed to talk before other people interrupt you. You're very forgiving, you too. It's very easy for those conversations to go wrong, and so in many cases a moderated environment is a really helpful one. There's an enormous amount of so much of what we do on the internet at least has the semblance of and the feeling of freedom to us. And the second part of the answer, I'll be really, really fast, is it's very easy, because we've gotten used to it, to forget about the enormous number of works of various sorts that are licensed under open licenses, including tons and tons of software, but also Creative Commons licenses that are used for all sorts of types of creativity, where people build things for other people for free. And these things become resources for the internet, where people answer questions for other people, building up a body of questions that basically can take, in one example, Stack Overflow, can turn a beginner programmer into a pretty good programmer. Because every question you want is pretty much answered, and answered for free by other developers who have a commitment to learning in public, making the place better. So I am not as convinced that and here the hour does become dicier, depends who and what sort of person and what group and class and country and race and gender that you're talking about. But I think that still that much of our experience on the internet comes either directly or indirectly through what can quite reasonably be called the free and open internet.
Yeah, I think one change I've seen, and this is, I'm going to give an observation, and hopefully you'll have more to add, but I had turned on an ad blocker a long time ago and used an ad blocker for quite a while. And then we found that it disrupted some of the stuff that we do, like when we try to stream from Zoom to Facebook. Ad blockers seem to muck with that a little bit. So I started turning ad blockers off again after really a very long time of having ad blockers on. And I was shocked at the extent to which all pages have been hung with ad after ad after ad, to the extent that it completely disrupts the page layout. It's just quite amazing, and this is more and more common. And furthermore, uh, you have sites that can detect the ad blocker and force you to disable it for their site. And you have sites now that have paywalls so that you can't reliably link to just any content online, because a lot of it will be blocked behind a paywall. Some have some online publications have the sense to have kind of a freemium model where a few views are offered for free, so that if somebody just happens to follow a link there, hopefully they'll be able to see what was linked. But with all of this, the internet has become so much more like television, which was more and more filled with ads and longer ads between the programming. Um, and I just find myself wondering whether people will throw up their hands at some point and stop at least visiting those kinds of sites. I mean, like, we have a site that has no advertising. We're actually not um, doing much to try to make money with the work that we're doing here. We do it for love, but um, many people aren't doing that and can't do that. And I just fear that um, that the internet as we knew it has actually sort of disappeared under layers and layers of advertising.
it can be very hard to excavate it to find. Yesterday, I have not been making sourdough bread, much as I like sourdough bread, but I did make bread yesterday. And so I went on my phone, invisible phone, I Googled for baguettes. Sorry. Um, I guess I'm not a real American. But I Googled for baguettes, and the first recipe that came up in Google looked good. And I think this is actually quite a common, I think it's basically a cliched experience at this point with recipes. I started scrolling, and there's an enormous amount of irrelevant text telling me about baguettes because they're looking for more room for advertising. And as you scroll down, so many advertisements overlay their own damn content that I actually did have to give up, because I'd swipe the ad away, and it would bounce me back up to where I'd just been reading, and I couldn't get down to. So, it reached that site reached a tipping point. It was the number one site, I believe. Yes, the amount of ads is appalling. We are getting inured to them, at least to some extent, except maybe when you're trying to find the recipe and it's covered by layers of ads. And yet the free unsponsored internet is there, and there's sponsored internet, which is sites that are not obnoxious in their sponsoring. I mean, podcasts are an internet phenomenon. I think they're changing a whole lot of things. It's a really important development. I have no problem at all. Most of the podcasts I listen to, most are in fact interrupted by ads. It's just like TV, and I skip over them, just like on TV. And it doesn't bother me. I mean, that doesn't bother me, because people are allowed to try to make money off of their work. And if it enables good podcasts, if that's what they need, then great. Also, and Patreon, there's a, so
maybe we need a new version of HTML that is written to accommodate ads so that they can be better integrated into the page.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't know that it would happen.
Well, I mean, this is, in fact, wasn't the W3C heavily criticized? Cory Doctorow, for one, I'm going to get this wrong. I shouldn't even be talking about it because I'll just get it wrong. I think that's something we should be careful about, but obviously I don't know enough about to comment on, even though I just started to.
I think what you probably should do is get an ad blocker and a good recipe for ciabatta.
I do have an ad blocker.
Well, try the ciabatta. I was making ciabatta for a while. It's actually not too hard to make, and it's
I like the crusty French bread. And the one that I used worked out. It was really pretty simple and worked out. It was good. We had good French bread. Not good French bread, but homemade. It was fine. And the fact that we can rely upon, basically at this point, just about anything we want to know, we can find out. Occasionally, especially if it's depending on what you're looking for, you can run into different sorts of gated sites. Academic journals are still a problem. There's lots of articles I come to that I either can't download, or I am, because of my affiliation with the Berkman Center, which is at Harvard, I still have some library access, but that's talk about real privilege. On the other hand, so I don't deny anything you said, John. It's everybody's experience, including mine. It's frustrating and maddening, and it's really disappointing, but it's not yet heartbreaking to me. In the past few years, we've seen the development of more than a few sites that have tons and tons of high quality photos for free. We've always had Flickr, God bless its heart, that had a strong commitment to Creative Commons and built its own commons. And we've had Wikimedia Commons, which has also been really helpful. But now we have sites that if you want sort of really high quality images, you can get them. And many of those are pure public domain. We have real growth over the past 15 years in the open access movement. In some fields, academic fields, it is the norm. In others, they're still pushing back. You have major uh, publishers, academic publishers. Um, for example, MIT Press is under Amy Brand is really committed to open access publishing. I edit a series for them, but this is, I guess it's an ad, but it's not a compensated thing. And the series I edit is hybrid. You can get it stuff open access, or you can, if you want, you can buy a hard copy.
Yeah, I think
And
Brett
that's amazing.
Frischman is working on some kind of data commons initiative.
There's tons and tons of open data now for all sorts of things. If you want to either play around with machine learning or if you want to do actual data research, I tend to weigh towards the playing around. In area after area, even as the internet has grown and the proportion of closed, locked, for pay, ad riddled stuff has grown, you almost always can find what you want, uh, either in a place with inobtrusive ads, they're making a living out of doing it or making some money for the effort they're putting in, great, or in the open access, open source ethos that is common on the internet. And that's an amazing thing. That was simply not possible. It wasn't true 25 years ago. People weren't routinely making choices about whether they should publish to the world or try to make some money by throwing ads over the very thing they want people to see. That possibility of publishing to the world, of engaging with the world, simply wasn't there. Now it's one of your choices, and tons of people do it. That's maybe overwhelmed by the commercial internet, but it's not an either or.
Well, earlier we were talking about advertising, commercials, and such. And I've been reading a lot about something called AI washing. And you've done a great deal of work around AI and machine learning. And I've seen a lot of advertising where they claim it's artificial intelligence. And some of the people have analyzed these products, and that turns out they're not really true AI. They're more like simple automation that's been dressed up and stamped AI. What's your feeling about this type of product?
Yeah, I think that it's always been the case that people who want to ride the latest tech wave stretch the truth of what they're doing, and maybe it's big data analytics, and it got rebranded as AI. And that's too bad. It's just a little confusing, but it's such a real temptation, and the terms are so loose. Um, so yeah, it doesn't bother me too much. If depending, I guess, on the degree to which they're lying. But it's clearly indicative that, to me, is one of the clear indicators that we are entering a new age. And the length of these ages is shortening dramatically over time. So we had the computer age or the information age starting from the 1950s, running up through the PC era in the 80s, and then we had, I would say, arguably the era of it's PC age, and that's sort of part of the computer and information age, but it was in many ways different enough. Then we had the internet age, and no question in my mind that the internet is a dominant enough technology that it's proper to call it its own age. It has so dominated not just what we do, but how we think about things. How I mean, the internet not only was a permission-free space, which still is if you want it to be, in which anybody can contribute without having to ask permission, build the thing that they want. It was also the largest infrastructure by far that humans have ever built, and it was still done without a manager, without any management. There's no management team. There's nobody who has a business card that says manager of the World Wide Web or of the internet. That is a mind-blowing accomplishment and change in how we think about how to engage in large-scale projects as well as small projects. So many things have taken on sort of the topology, the architecture of the internet, lots of little pieces that are connected multiply to many others. And that's become invisible to us. It's so common. But certainly many Areas of business have taken on uh, this aspect, sometimes formally. Supply chains we now tend to think of as, even if we don't call them supply webs, but that's generally how we think about them. I personally think the construction, our idea of how knowledge works, knowledge has taken on the form of a network, um, and a network of the internet sort, in which um, nodes can disagree. Everything is linked, but those links are sometimes contradiction. Say, and if you want to see a point of view that I'm arguing against, here's a link to that. Um, I think knowledge definitely has taken, from my point of view, has definitely taken on that aspect. It's still in struggle against authorities that want to manage it down and like, but that's what it's become. So the internet in that regard has been and remains enormously successful. And that's why I'm happy to say we've been living in the internet age. It seems to me that the fact that everybody wants to be on the AI bandwagon now is one of the indicators. It's one of the weaker indicators, but it's definitely an indicator that we are already stepping into the age of AI or the age of machine learning.
Yeah, well, your latest book, I assume that when you called it Everyday Chaos, you weren't referring to Donald Trump, that you were
No,
writing about something different.
yeah,
Why did you call it Everyday Chaos? What are you seeing there?
because I couldn't think of a better title. I'm not crazy about the title, but it, this book took 6 years of thinking and writing, many drafts and titles and different ideas about what the book is about, and I think that I'm still trying to find quick ways to say what the book is about, which is not a good thing for a trade or commercial book, but which is what it is. So I'll leave the title aside for the moment. It was the idea behind the title was, one of the ways to explain what the book is about is that we have, and it's not a bad way actually, is that chaos theory arose in the 1970s. The internet has plunged us into the world that chaos theory describes. It's a pretty close match, in which overwhelming amount of stuff for sure, lots of little pieces, lots of intricate connections, and lots of non-linear things, where all of a sudden the rules behind something just change like that. It just hits a point, and that's what virality is about, for example, right? And unpredictability because of this, because of the overwhelming amount of stuff in the intricate connections. So if you are in marketing and somebody, as I have been, and somebody says, we really need something to go viral, like so-and-so's, our competitor's video went viral, or like the ice bucket challenge went viral. And you have to tell the person, usually the CEO, it doesn't work like that. If there were rules to making things go viral, well, everybody would be doing it, but it's some combination of who knows why it went viral. But that's common. That's one of the distinguishing marks of the internet. These things blow up and we don't know why. And you walk down paths that you can't predict, and often you can't remember how you got there. That's what a chaotic world looks like. So the internet got us used to it. Machine learning is giving us, at least I think, and the book argues, is giving us a model for understanding how that chaos works. It doesn't give us a model that lets us understand how predictions are made in it, but it gives us a sort of a visualization of what the chaos of that world is like. And so I think this is the bed of the book, and I've been wrong before, as we started off with. The bet of the book is that since we tend to understand ourselves through our technology, if we understand ourselves through machine learning and through machine learning models, then what do we in our world look like? And it is a world in which it is chaotic in the classic 1970 sense. Lots and lots and lots of little points of data, lots of correlations, billions of correlations that in which are discovered some patterns that are so interdependent and contingent that a small thing may be just enough to flip the model to predict this or to predict that. But the configuration may be unique and so complex and so many thousands of variables that we can't figure it out. But
Well,
that's the way that is exactly the way the world works.
can you explain what we mean when we talk about machine learning, how machines learn, and how that relates to artificial intelligence?
Um, Machine learning is a type of AI, but it's the types that most people are referring to these days when they talk about AI. The distinguishing mark of machine learning um, is that, as you and everybody well know, in normal programming, you figure out what the logic of a situation is. You build the logical rules, you feed in data, and it processes it according to logical rules and gives you an outcome. A spreadsheet, we have formulas connecting. It's that type of logic, connecting the cells, and you put in data and you get your answer. But that requires you knowing how things work and being able to express it in some finite set of knowable rules. And for a lot of spreadsheet work, that's the case. A lot of spreadsheet work is helpful, but it's you're not surprised when things turn out differently. Because there was a fire in the warehouse of one of your suppliers. Unpredictable, but there goes that cell. You couldn't predict it, and that's going to change things. Machine learning isn't like that. It's actually, I still find it completely mind-blowing what it's able to do. You don't tell it what you know about how things work in the domain you are, teaching it about. You instead just give it data, and you don't tell it what you think the connection of the data connections are. So, a relatively simple example. About 5 years ago, at Mount Sinai Hospital, they did a project called Deep Patient, in which they fed in 700,000 medical records, each with about 500 data points. And they used this in order to, so they fed it in. It's just numbers, right? That they took out identifying information and the like, which is, can be a real issue. They fed it in. They did not tell it what we humans know, which is, oh, here's medicines. And by the way, here's the medicines here are the diseases these medicines work for. These are diseases, these are medicines, these are the relationships that we know about. We didn't tell them anything. We just gave them numbers, labeled numbers, and gave it labeled numbers, and it did the machine learning thing of trying to find correlations among these numbers, really blindly and stupidly. It doesn't know that this medicine is an indicator that you have heart disease or whatever. It just looked for relationships purely in numbers and found correlations to the extent that you could feed in a new medical record and it would make diagnoses and some predictions. And for some diseases, it was as accurate as human doctors are. And in other predictions, it was more accurate. And for some diseases, it was able to make predictions that we simply cannot predict the onset of these diseases. And it was making probabilistic, but significantly correct predictions. It's totally out of ignorance. It's only numbers. It works because, at least at this stage, because we have withdrawn from it our assumptions about how things go together. And it found enough regularities that at least for some stuff, it can do a pretty good job. That was an experiment and a project. Obviously, there's tons and tons more work, much of it being applied in the world.
Yeah,
it's not the way we were taught the world works, that you can look at all of these little pieces and from it come out with a prediction, and sometimes not be able to understand it because the factors that determine what happens in this world are so overwhelming and so complex. And our little brains we have taught them to look for, or evolution did, to look for generalizations.
Can you bias the results based on the data set you select?
Oh, how can you not? No, 100%. And it's very, very dangerous. And there's a lot of really great work being done, but it's not a solved problem. And there's a reason to think it's never going to be a fully solved problem because data reflects human biases, right? The data that Mount Sinai was using came from their patients. Their patients come from generally from particular portions of New York. There's those tremendous amount of attention and really good work being done on it, but it's not clear that it's a fully solvable problem. because the bias comes from data that reflects us, and we are biased in what we do and even what data we collect.
And we don't
So
always know our biases.
even worse, absolutely.
Right.
And there's really great work being done on that as well. There's a book called Data Feminism by Catherine Ignazio and Lauren Kaplan. It's in my series, so I really should know this, which is about the unconscious bias. You know, the data is gendered in its concept and almost always in its collection. It's a really good book. So in the case of Deep Patient, Mount Sinai was gathering data from, it was data that it had from its patients, but its patients represent a slice of New York. That's like no reason to think that slice of New York is representative of all of New York or all of humanity. And so it's biased. It may not apply to other cities, other cultures, other demographics, and the rest of it. Pernicious biases show up all over. I mean, even just figuring out what will count as a success in your machine learning application is subject to huge bias. And the sort of standard example, because it's a good one, is that if you are in a city and you use AI to optimize the efficiency of your public transportation, and it does, this is just for buses, it does, in that it's now, system is now carrying more people for less time, right? The people are getting, more people are getting to where they're going and they're getting there faster. So that works fine until somebody points out, oh, you know what? It's sort of just going around the outskirts of the poor part of town, or so, you know, the service is worse in the poor part of town, even though it's way better. And overall, the system did exactly what you told it to. It optimized for efficiency. It doesn't, you forgot to tell it that that's not the only value here. These systems have no sense of morality or fairness. And the data is almost, I want to be careful because, you know, there's data coming from the Large Hadron Collider, which is, if it's biased in a different way than data coming from municipalities in which poor people and people of color are getting shafted against, right? But data, bias in data is an endemic problem, and it's rooted in the fact that we are biased and we don't always know we're biased.
Well, with
So it's something to watch out
data,
for sure.
with there being bias in data, big data is getting a bad rap in certain areas just because there are so many people collecting everything they can get their hands on in hopes of being able to sell it to someone else for some either good or nefarious use. Do you think this uh, rebellion against big data is good, bad, indifferent?
It's a good question. I don't have a great answer. So it seems clear to me that the success and utility of machine learning sort of drives up the value of data. There's more you can do with it. So in that sense, it provides a greater incentive for companies to invade our privacy and to resell our data. On the other hand, machine learning is, its potential is we're only beginning to explore. We are so used to setting our expectations according to what we are able to predict based upon the general laws that we're able to discover, that we're not used to, we're constantly being surprised, I think in pleasant ways, usually, to discover that, in fact, if you just provide lots of data and don't worry too much about what our general laws are, these, which is really, that these systems can come up with applications that we did not think were possible. So I'm bullish on AI as a tool for science and for the humanities, for that matter, and for social good, while being aware that unless it's very carefully handled, the data that represents us will simply will reproduce the same sorts of unfairness and racism that's been endemic in our culture. I think one of the, so I'm sorry, I'm gonna say two things really briefly. One of the questions is, rather than So if the question is AI machine learning biased, I think the answer should be assumed to be yes, even if you've taken very careful steps. But the right question is, can it be less, in particular circumstances, can it be less biased than we are? And in some circumstances, I think we're seeing that that is in fact the case. The second thing is privacy issues are real for sure. I don't think that, I may be wrong about this, but I don't think that they are specific to AI, machine learning, that we need to be thinking long, hard, and carefully about how to preserve our data privacy as citizens and as customers and the rest.
Yeah, which has been a huge challenge for a long time. I was part of a kind of, it was a strategic foresight project where we were envisioning the mayor's office of the future. And in this project, part of the backstory was that there was, I mean, there was like a human mayor, but part of the backstory was that there had been an AI mayor before the human mayor, and that the reason the AI mayor was no longer serving as mayor was because AI mayors had been outlawed because their lack of the human element or component in of judgment had caused disasters in some contexts. And I thought that was a pretty interesting conception. And it has always seemed to me that one of the problems with what we refer to as robots or artificial intelligences, et cetera, is that it's tempting to think of them as being like humans, but there's no way that they will be like humans. I mean, they're just not. I mean, they're not carbon-based life forms, and the way that they quote think is entirely different, and so far is pretty much contingent on how we set them up. We configure them to think the way that they think. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
So I agree with, I'm going to give you an example, but I agree with basically everything you just said. They don't think like us. They profoundly do not think like us. They are statistical engines, and that's it, machine learning systems. I guess, first of all, let me give you an example. There is, I think now, a famous or infamous machine learning system, which I think frankly barely qualifies. It's not so complex, but it's machine learning. That was the famous ProPublica article exposed a few years ago, which is fairly widely used within the judicial system to recommend sentences or bail, depending which end of the process you're in. And it was discovered that there are, even though the company argues against this, that there were serious issues of bias, as one can imagine, because it's using data that comes from humans, and that we know the judicial system is very biased. You just won't even, I don't think I have to argue this with you, John. So that's a real danger, right? But I still see some hope for the use of recommendation systems, AI-based recommendation systems in the judicial system, so long as there are humans in the loop, as long as it's a recommendation system and it's not an automatic sentencing one. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I think that the bail setting system in cities generally is an abomination. People come in to see whether they're going to make bail or not, and it's literally a minute in front of a judge with a lawyer who's met them for 5 minutes, maybe. It's 1 or 2 minutes, and bail is set, and the person is either taken back to prison to await trial or is released. that is a horrible, horrible, necessarily unfair system. Can you imagine? I mean, having your liberty taken away. And I say this as an elderly white man to other, nothing personal, rather elderly, I think less so elderly white men. And no, we probably can't imagine it because it's not, it's not the world we've been living in. Privilege. So that's a terrible, terrible system. If there was a better set of AI that could make recommendations, that might be helpful. Likewise for sentencing, especially for sentencing. I think it's a little clearer where judge is thinking, hey, I'm going to give this person 10 to 15. And if she or he gets, a finding from the AI saying, do what you want, of course, judge, I'm just an AI. But that's way harsher than our analysis shows has been the case or should be the case. And we also have noticed that you're usually on the harsh side when you're sentencing people of color. Maybe you want to think about that. It is conceivable in some utopian scientific world, science fiction world, that AI can be actually a force to moderate some of the human bias. I'm putting a very positive face on a very dangerous phenomenon.
So, what do you most fear from AI and machine learning? If anything, I guess.
No, there's plenty to fear. The bias is obviously a big part of it. Part of it is that it will become overregulated too early by regulators who don't understand it well enough, and we will lose some of its potential. But part of it is a harder thing to express, unfortunately. So there's a lot of wonderful work being done on AI and fairness on these very issues. From my point of view, one of the really good things about AI in this regard is that AI is just a stupid machine. It won't do anything. It will do what you tell it. But if you don't tell it, oh, it's not just the bus efficiency we're looking for, we also need to make sure it's equitable. If you don't tell it that, it will not be equitable. It will be unfair. But what counts as unfair? It needs to be told in a way that is actionable by a machine, by a statistical machine. Machine learning is forcing us to think about the concept of fairness in such exquisite detail that we have been able to skirt in the past. We talk about fairness too often as if it's obvious what fairness is, and yet we spend years, decades, arguing about what is in fact fair in a particular case. The affirmative action is 50 years old, and we're still arguing. I think maybe 60 years old. It was 61, I think. Anyway, it's generations now of people dealing with this, and we're still arguing about it. Fairness is way more complex than we have told ourselves. Maybe because unfairness is really pretty easy to spot in many instances, but fairness, how to remedy it, subject to gigantic debates. We've been able to avoid this fact because we haven't had the vocabulary to talk about it. We haven't been actually held our feet to the fire. But if you're going to program, you're going to set up a machine learning system and train the model, you have to tell it exactly what you want. Are false positives better than false negatives? Because it's going to be some of both, because these are probabilistic machines. Which would you rather have? If it's machine learning predicting where to police, false positives turn out to be really, really unfair and have terrible consequences because you're rousting people in a part of town because you've decided it's better to err on the side of safety by rousting people who may or may not actually be a threat. It's different when you're scanning people in an airport to try to find terrorists or whatever. You have to tell it exactly what you want. This requires us to get so focused and detailed about our ideas about fairness that we can begin to have conversations that actually engage with the topic. So I'm hopeful about that, even though it means our conversations about fairness are about to get much more specific and much harder to resolve. But now at least we'll know why. they're hard to resolve.
One part of machine learning that a lot of people are concerned about in the area of image recognition is license plate readers that are being rolled out to many, many law enforcement agencies that just sit by the side of the road and suck up every license plate it sees, and they're distributed by companies that's their business. So there's a little bit of the big data marketing going on there. What's your opinion on that use of machine learning?
Um, I don't. My opinion on that in particular, I don't think bears any weight. What I think it points to is the fact that we need to be making decisions about what data we want to collect and what we don't. And for example, um, there were a few decades ago, police were setting up automated radar traps that would, take a photo of your license plate and you'd get a bill, you'd get a fine in the mail. And people hated that. And I don't think there's much of it going on in this country anymore, even though even on the Massachusetts Turnpike, I live in Massachusetts, they've torn out the tolls and they've put up gates, towers over the segments of the road in order to communicate with your transponder or take a photograph of your license, and then if you signed up, it deducts the you pay your toll, which is fine. But that means that these sites know how fast you've been going on average, and if you got there too quickly to the next the next gate, then they could easily fine you. Why not? I mean, if it says you were going 80, you had to be going an average of 80, then most people, I think, would say, or 90, most people would say, oh, okay, I mean, that's a fair ticket. That's too fast for a 65-mile-an-hour road, but we don't do it. I personally am glad that they don't do it, but I can't tell you why. I think it's just an emotional response. We need to be having, as this becomes more and more possible, and as many, many more things become possible, we need to be having that conversation. But it's the same conversation, for example, as should we put up lots of CCD cameras to record people? I mean, in London, they have literally hundreds of thousands of them. The populace doesn't seem to be up in arms. I don't know that the cameras are doing much good or much bad. I really don't know. But that's a conversation that you have. I think it's sort of independent of AI. What's the trade-off we're willing to make, along with an informed idea about how things could possibly go wrong. Because I will say I was more casual about data collection, privileged old white man, for example, that has a lot to do with it, before Trump, on the grounds that I'm more worried about what the government does with the data than the fact that they collect it, because I was assuming, how bad could it be? And then Trump's elected and we see exactly how bad it can be. So I was pretty wrong.
I'm in the same boat on that one. I was really pretty blasé about it, and people would tell me, "Well, what if we had a fascist dictator take power?" And I said, "That's not going to happen."
How could that happen?
Exactly.
Could be happening. Could be happening.
Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I think that we've taken as much of your time as we had agreed to.
I got nothing going on, but that's fine.
Well, I could ask one more question that I had that I've been thinking about. I see a lot of people using the term sense making and talking about, sense making. I think they're like just trying to interpret the meaning of what they're seeing in the world and trying to find some, I guess, strategic significance in it, or kind of understand where we are and where we're going and so forth. And I just wonder about how AI and machine learning may already be used or might be used for this kind of thing.
So I think sense making is really, really, really important. I think it's a consequence of the sorts of things we've been talking about. That it's a world in which there's so much and it's all connected, but it's also therefore all disconnected, because you can only be connected if you're disconnected, right? It's not all, so many different points of view. It's we've never had this sort of global chaotic world before that we can easily travel through. It's really, really hard. The authorities that used to insist on a single sense to things have, they don't work anymore. That doesn't work so well anymore. So making sense, and now we also have a medium in which we can make sense together. And an enormous amount of what I see on the internet, and much of it positive, can be seen as a type of collective sense making. I think it's an amazing development that this has happened. I mean, we used to talk about conversations. I mean, we still do, John. Back in the day, markets are conversations, as Stock said. But the point of conversations sometimes it's just, but often it is, let's try to make sense of this, and we're going to fail, but let's try. So I think we could we could characterize everything that's going on as sense making. So AI actually does help, at least at times, as any form of data analysis can help, in helping to find the type of sense that we have made of things, whether it's analyzing, you can think about it as word clouds taken to, a billion times more complex. Word cloud is a type of sense making, right? Where whether you are doing it algorithmically over some body of text, or you're at a conference and people are, sort of informally doing it, tells you, okay, these words are more important. If it's done algorithmically, strategically, statistically, these words are more important. That gives you something, nobody's going to put too much stock in, but still. AI can do that, except at a far, far greater level of detail, and allow you to ask all sorts of questions about ideas and concepts that may be quite far distant in their meaning. It can be a tremendous tool for seeing how we, reflected in the data and our word use or image use, etc., how we are making sense of the world. That can be a great tool.
And there might be things we're missing that the AI finds in the data.
You can imagine all sorts of prejudices and biases that get turned up when you start doing this sort of analysis. I can't think of any examples, but it's conceivable that some words cluster together, some of which seem quite innocent, but seem to be part of mathematical, statistical relationship with words that are not nearly so innocent. So it's not a good example, but I'll stick with it for now.
Well, David, I really want to thank you. This has been great. We've enjoyed talking to you. Hope you'll come back sometime.
Anytime. I've always enjoyed our conversations and our long-term friendship.
Absolutely.
It's been too long.
It has been too long. It's been a very long time.
It takes a podcast to get us together. I'm all in favor. Scoop, really nice to meet you.
My pleasure. We'll have to have you back for sure.
Anytime. Got nothing going on.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you.
We'll talk to you very soon, I hope.
Learn more about David at Weinberger.org or follow him on Twitter as @DWeinberger. You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.